From the media, the public, the politicians, the question is the same. With all the government support during the pandemic, where is all that money coming from and how long is it going to take to pay back? Well, we'll remind ourselves today about modern monetary theory and the principle that money doesn't have to be paid back. But when so much new money has been created, isn't there a danger that there is an imbalance? And is that part of the reason we are seeing inflation starting to get out of control? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, there's the eternal question whenever the government has to step in with a lot of assistance, like, for example, when there's a pandemic on, for example, the question is often asked, where's all the money coming from? Well, you'll know if you're a regular listener to this podcast that money is fundamentally created in two ways. So we won't dwell on this too long today because we've discussed it so many times. But just a quick précis, Steve, step in if I get this wrong, but I think I've got it right. First of all, it comes from commercial bank loans. They put money into your account that didn't exist before you asked for that loan. And they just need to make sure that they've got enough reserves to cover any of those interbank settlements that happen as you spend that money with companies or people who use another bank. So that's number one. Then there's government spending. They spend money. They issue bonds, which are bought first off by commercial banks. They switch cash reserves for those bonds. So the government has the cash, which it can then spend. So that's new money as well. So, Steve, I guess during the pandemic, we've probably seen quite a bit of both of those, which is why we're seeing the money supply increase so much. And it's skyrocketed over the last year and a half.
Yeah, in the case of both of them with reserves, banks used to have 30 days to do that settlement, by the way, so banks could actually run their reserves down, not have sufficient reserves, in fact have negative reserves, and then over a given 1 month to get them back to the stage where they were positive. And normally they'd borrow those reserves from another bank, because if you have an interbank transfer, then the reserves go from the lending bank to the bank where the borrower puts their money. Of course, that was back before computers. It took 30 days back then. Now, of course, with computers, it takes 45 days. So they have even longer to get their books settled. And in the case of government bonds, I know some monetary reformers make a song and dance about the government needing, according to legislation, to sell bonds ahead of actual spending. But the amount of excess reserves that have been created by the government over time mean that given bonds being sold, sort of monthly auctions are quite common. Of that sort of frequency is quite common. There's enough existing reserves to enable the first tranche to be easily covered, and then with later tranches, the deficit itself creates both the reserves that are used to buy the bonds and the money in people's accounts. So there's no effective constraint coming from reserves on lending of either banks or money creation by the government.
Right. But in normal times, the Bank of England says most of the money in the economy is created by banks when they provide loans. So that must be more of the money supply than coming from overspending governments.
Absolutely.
But if that's the case, that money does have to be paid back eventually. Of course, when it gets paid back, the loan gets paid back. There'll be someone else taking out another loan. But the fact that the money supply keeps on increasing must mean, unless banks are offering ever greater loans, the supply won't expand. And we need the supply to expand, because if we've got inflation, which obviously is, a part and parcel of the survival of the monetary system, if we want the money to supply to expand, we need banks to give more and more loans for that expansion to happen.
Yeah,
that's a problem.
The system,
isn't it?
In monetary terms, the system won't expand unless banks lend more than they get back in repayments, or unless governments run a deficit. And this is, I've actually just refereed a very good paper, actually, where the statistician was taking a look at where does the demand come, how to model the demand. It's actually a mathematician looking at how to model demand in the economy, and said a lot of non-mainstream models have this idea of autonomous spending. And when I looked at his classifications of autonomous spending, it was all things financed either by credit or by governments running a deficit. And when you think about it, it then says to actually get a measurable increase in the GDP of an economy measured in dollars per year. The fundamental way that is done is increasing the number of dollars. And the way that numbers of dollars increase by banks lending more than they get back in repayments, or by government spending more than they get back in taxation.
But I mean, that means if it's people getting loans, then it's debt, isn't it? It's people running up debt, and debt is really just bringing spending forward. I get a loan, I spend it, then I spend years cutting back on my spending as I try and pay back that loan. But so ultimately, how much I spend is determine how much money I earn, of course. So I can't spend more than I earn, but I can bring a bit forward by getting a loan. So there's that's a limit, then, isn't it, on how much obviously is lent out in the end?
What you see is people spend predominantly based on the amount of money they've got.
Yeah.
And if you have an increase in the money and an increase in debt, that's sustainable so long as the turnover of money enables you to make enough of a gain from your economic activity to finance the interest costs on the borrowing. And that, the fundamental story is both credit and net government deficits are sources of additions to aggregate demand. And
the multiplier would mean that, you'd hope that extra money, therefore, would, create the multiplier effect. People would turn it over faster because you'd be putting it to productive use. But that's not really happening, is it? I mean, the more we're seeing the money supply expand, the more we're seeing this debt being issued, whether it's to individuals or to the government. We seem to be seeing the velocity of money slowing down.
Well, this is largely because of, first of all, the increasing level of debt itself reduces the income of the poor. This is something that comes out of my complex systems modelling of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. And that shows that there's a direct relationship, an increase in the level of debt and a fall in the share going to workers. And there's a complicated dynamic behind it, but it is quite easy to understand what actually is going on there. But what that means is, even though the additional money borrowed into the economy in the models that I build and to some extent in the real world enables a high level of turnover of the economy itself, it ends up pushing the wealth towards the bankers away from the workers. And the bankers, by definition, are much wealthier than the workers and therefore spend more slowly. So you also get a double whammy that the velocity of circulation falls. And that is...
And let's be honest. I mean, if a bank is giving a loan to somebody and it's somebody who's on struggle street on a minimum wage, they're probably not going to give it to them. If somebody else comes along and says, hey, I need this money to buy a house, there's an asset that you can attach the loan to, or I'm going to use it to buy shares. I mean, obviously, in both those cases, non-productive uses of money, but the money is being created. We're seeing the money supply expand.
Yeah, and that's the danger that we've got. So that's over and above the sort of generic tendency I was talking about earlier. But that means we have a tendency for the level of debt to rise and that increasing level of debt to be associated with a fall in the rate of circulation of money, so that you end up getting caught in a double whammy. You end up with a huge amount of debt, and then people who borrow themselves individually decide to spend more slowly, because that's the way they try to accumulate some of that additional money in their own accounts so that they can pay their level of debt down. And you get this just slows the whole economy down. And that's what we've been seeing, really. You look at the empirical data, this has been happening since the 1960s. There's been, even though the rate of turnover of money itself increased up to the peak of the inflation rate in the prelude to the Volcker recession in the early 1980s, even though that velocity rose across that period of time, the rate of economic growth was slowing right from 1960 forward. So the combination of the two, when you get into a low inflation environment, which is where we found ourselves until just recently, is just a plunge in how fast money turns over. And that ends up with you being in a stagnant economy.
So to what extent do central banks look at this? Because they obviously think...
Pardon me? What?
Well, I mean, supposedly they should be. I think it's their job, isn't it? But they think
I can talk out of school these days. Guy Debelle, who was deputy director of the Reserve Bank of Australia,
RBA.
In a conversation with me, the conference in Adelaide about 12 or 13 years ago, said to me, and I quote, "I don't know why you worry about the debt to GDP ratio because you're comparing a stock to a flow."
Right, which we've talked about before, in a recent podcast,
Yeah. So that shows a complete lack of awareness of the very issues we're talking about here, and of course the validity of comparing a stock to a flow when you're trying to work out the time constant as to how often the stock turns over. And that therefore, if you get that sort of thing from a deputy governor of a reserve bank, and I also recommend you take a look at the ECB's speech by a recent ECB speech where Peter Pratt, I think it was called, I call him Peter Prattle for short. Peter Prattle was asked to explain how money is created and made a complete stuff of it. And those are people who run central banks. So yes, this is a case where the ideology they have, that what they think is economic theory, means that they collect the data and don't know how to interpret
Well, for those who don't really understand how they're supposed to work, I mean, for monetary policy, I mean, they do believe it can control everything, don't they? Because they think if you control interest rates, that's going to control how much people borrow, and that will determine how they control the money supply, how the bank controls the money supply. Very straightforward. And until you look and say, well, okay, but also what about who's it going to, and what does that do to the velocity of money? And I suspect central banks just don't think about that then.
And they don't even, I mean, you mentioned interest rates as a control on the level of spending. This again is ignorant of what Keynes pointed out in the 1930s, that it isn't the interest rate that determines how much you're willing to invest. It's your expectations of profit that determine how much you're willing to invest. And if you think there's going to be like a 10% rate of return on your investment, and you have a central bank charging putting a 3 or 4% rate of interest, you're going to dive in there and borrow no matter what. And the bank can double the rate of interest, and you still think you're going to come out ahead. So to actually be able to use the interest rate to control the economy, you can't fine tune it in the way their models talk about, because with their models, you know the future, you know what the return is going to be on various investments. So varying the only way to reduce your level of investment is to reduce the net present value of those investment returns over time, and that can be easily done by manipulating the interest rate. Now, in the real world, where your expectations are of capital gain, and this is again something Keynes covered beautifully in his 1937 papers, if you expect a capital gain that's going to double your money, you can forget about controlling people's spending on that basis using the interest rate. You'll never put the interest rate up to 50%, but if people expect a 50% gain, they'll dive in there and borrow no matter what. And you only bring that to an end by crushing the entire economy with interest rates. It's not a fine-tuned mechanism, and they're leaving out expectations.
Yes, I take your point. If you're investing in and getting a good capital gain, you don't care. If you are a low income and we're struggling on a mortgage, then you will feel it. So it's actually
it'll wipe you
making
out,
the situation worse. So this velocity of money, which has been slowing right down, before the pandemic, it was slowing down. In the US, for example, it was 2.4 at the turn of this century, around 2000. It got steadily down to 1.9 before the pandemic. So, I mean, you have to, with that sort of slowdown, because that's what that's like 20%. If you had no increase in money supply, that would mean the size of the economy had shrunk by that much. So you need to, if we've got a slowing down velocity of money, then we do need to increase the amount of money that's in circulation to compensate. Otherwise, we'll see a recession or a big slowdown in the economy.
Yeah, and that is when
that's
governments get it in their heads that they should run surpluses. That adds to the problem, because that means the only other way to get the money is to get into more debt. And once you start reaching the astronomical levels of private debt we're carrying these days, people's willingness to do that is also quite low. So what you get is a slowdown in credit growth as well as a slowdown in deficit-funded growth.
And yet we are seeing money increase. So it must be the banks
because of the deficits,
giving loans. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in terms of the scale, the deficit in America was about 35% of GDP, wasn't it?
Yeah, massive amount. So let me give you figures in the UK, because the amount, well, not in terms of the deficit, but in the amount of money in circulation, which obviously relates back to it. It's increased from $750 billion in 2000 to about 3 trillion today. So that's a fourfold increase in the amount of pounds in circulation. I could say that's great, because that means more loans are out there. So that obviously means a more confident economy. If you want to look at the glass half full approach.
Yeah, I mean, what it actually is I'd actually be interested in what's happened in the last 2 years. Do you have the change over the last 1 or 2 years?
Funnily enough, I do. So before the pandemic, the M2 money supply in the UK was about £2.8 trillion. Now it's getting up to 3 trillion. So that's doesn't sound like a huge increase, but until you put it, it's actually expanded by 200 billion during the pandemic so far. And look, it's been going up quite a bit over the last few months as well, hasn't? Even though you'd think government spending was easing a bit, it's still going up. And so a couple of questions on that. Seeing this big increase during the pandemic, presumably a big chunk of that is coming from government overspending rather than from straight commercial bank loans. Is there a danger? Is there a point at which that becomes because obviously everyone is looking at that now, conventional economists are looking at that and saying, that's why we've got inflation, supply chains as well. But, it's the fact that there's so much money in circulation now as well, driven by all this government debt. I mean, have they got a point? Is there a point at which you can have the circulation, the money supply, not the circulation, but the actual supply of money increasing too fast?
You can. But our problem really has been for the last 20 years increasing too slowly, and when it's been increasing, it's been coming from private debt creation rather than from government spending, which then leads down to that dilemma I spoke about earlier of people spending more slowly to try to be able to service their debt. So you get a declining efficiency of the circulation of money. What I'd prefer to see is the deficits being run and the deficits creating that money, and then people don't have a private debt burden for their spending, so they continue spending at the sort of pre-crisis rate. So that's what you need. But the trouble is that we've pretty much handed money creation completely over to the private sector. And like when the private sector creates a debt, then that remains on the assets of the banking sector. It might be bundled up and sold to a non-bank financial institution when they do securitization, but it's still remaining on the the asset side of the financial sector. When the government sells bonds after it has created reserves by running a deficit, then the banks own those bonds, and one thing they can do is sell those bonds to non-bank financial institutions and sometimes the public. And when they do that reverses the money creation that's occurred beforehand. Which means that you undermine the government's capacity to create money by letting banks sell bonds to the private sector. And what I think
it goes back to the only way you're expanding money is through the commercial finance sector rather than by the government. If that's what's happening, But that's what happens now, because obviously we've got central banks buying a lot of those bonds. So is that's not destroying the money when that happens?
No, that's not destroying the money. No, nor is it creating the money. But if the central banks buy the bonds, then the bonds can't be sold by the private banks to the non-bank financial institutions or to the non-financial sector public. So that actually means that the money created by the government actually remains. And that is possibly what's happened this time round, that if you have larger central bank purchases of government bonds, then more of the money that the government has created remains in the private sector, and that boosts economic activity. So I'm actually in favour of central banks buying those bonds right now, because if they do, it means that the banking sector can't destroy the money created by the government by on-selling the bonds.
Right, and makes perfect sense. But if we've got this from 2000 to today, this fourfold increase in the amount of pounds in circulation, and we think almost all of that is going to be coming from commercial banks giving loans. So there's a heck of a lot of loans that they've been issuing over those years. If they were to carry on at that level, but we were also to say that the governments were going to be expanding at the same amount, then we would have just too much money floating in the market, wouldn't we? So we'd almost need to say, well, okay, if governments are overspending and adding to the amount of money in circulation, we need a way of making sure commercial banks don't do it quite so much.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call it overspending. I want the government to run a fairly permanent deficit to be able to create the money supply that enables the private sector.
Well, let's not call it overspending. I take your point. Overspending is not the right word, but okay. So the government is
spending
creating
more
money.
than they get back in taxation.
If the government creates money and we've got commercial banks creating money, let's keep it as simple as that. Couldn't we just have too much money? If the government is creating quite a lot, then don't we need commercial banks to spend quite a bit less or create quite a bit less?
But this seems to be what happens in a natural sense, because the reason you borrow money is because you haven't got any to begin with and you want to do something with money. Now, if you have a government running a substantial deficit, and this was the case in the 50s and 60s, then the money is already in your account. You don't need to borrow as much. You can finance more of what you want to do from cash flow. And that reduces the need for private sector borrowing. When the government decides to run a surplus and cuts off that increase, then the only way you're going to increase your money is by borrowing from a bank. But when you borrow from a bank, of course, your net assets don't change at all. Your assets go up, and your liability, the debt to the bank, go up by precisely as much. And I think this actually ends up being a major encourager of speculation, because then when you look at it, you think, oh, how can my assets have gone up, my liability has gone up just as much. How can I make my assets go up more? I know, I'll buy shares or buy houses.
Yeah, well, I wonder how that's going to stop that happening, though. If you've got, so the government is putting money into people's bank accounts, and it's not going to, unless we've got a universal basic income, and we can talk about that in a second. But if it's just government's overspending on projects which are finding its way into the bank accounts of businesses, and then that gets passed down to those businesses' employees. So, hopefully at the end of the day, everyone would see a bit more money in their bank accounts from that government spending. But that's not going to stop those people going to their bank and saying, oh, I've got a bit more money than I used to, therefore I can get a bigger loan for a bigger house. Well, probably not a bigger house, same sized house, but paying more for it.
I've got a feeling it does lead to that. I mean, when this is looking at economic history, during the 1920s, you had the what's his name? I can't think of the president of the States right now. Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge government running. He was very much an accountant in the way he approached everything, but an accountant who knows how household finances, not government finances. And he was ensuring that every year the surplus is 1% of GDP. And they had a booming economy, and he was taking credit and saying the boom is, my surplus is causing the boom. What was actually causing the boom is while he was paying down government debt by 1% of GDP per year, the private sector was increasing private sector debt by 5% of GDP per year. And that was all going into the roaring 20s and the booming stock market. And it was the increasing money coming in that actually was causing the stock market to boom. Now, when you got to the point where that stopped, the whole thing crashed and we had the Great Depression. So I think a major reason why people did borrow so much, not the only one, it could well be a reaction to the Spanish flu. We're now learning what it's like to live under a pandemic, so we can understand people wanting to, invent the Charleston after an experience like the Spanish flu. But in that situation where the government's taking money out of circulation, the only way to get it back in is to borrow, and then when you borrow, you don't have any net increase in your assets, so you go and think, well, how can I buy assets and benefit from a rising market? And the borrowing and the buying of assets causes the rising market, and you get a positive feedback loop, or amplifying feedback loop that leads to catastrophe ultimately. And ultimately it was, of course, October 21 or October 1929? I
wasn't around then, Steve.
The government's deficits, you were saying, wouldn't stop people going and borrowing as well. I think they do. And then this is my saying, when the government runs a surplus, it certainly seems to lead to people borrowing money. And the same thing applied during the Clinton era. We had Clinton, again, running a similar surplus, 1% of an average of GDP. It was actually rose to, I think, about 2 or 3% at one point. But that was the beginning that was during the middle of the dot-com and the internet bubble, and then followed by the subprime bubble. So you had an orgy of speculation. And that then meant the economy looked like it was going great until the orgy stopped.
Yeah, hate it when that happens. But aren't we at that situation now, in that we've had a heap of government money, which obviously has added to the money supply, but we are also seeing house prices going crazy all around the world, as well, as though people are still going and getting loans and and getting mortgages.
Yeah, and I think this is turning up late in the data, but I think that's what's going on. I think a combination of things. I mean, partly when you have more cash flow, then you have, you're closer to having a deposit. But having a deposit for like a house in Australia is out of the question unless you go to the bank of mum and dad. So it fundamentally is people borrowing money and getting caught up in speculation once more, and the borrowing money and then using that as your payment to buy a house. Is what causes the house price to rise. So you get a positive feedback, amplifying feedback again, between the increase in the rate of borrowing and the change in house prices. And that goes on until the whole thing comes crashing down when the increase in price is so much that it discourages new entrants.
So doesn't that mean then that, whereas we might normally get a situation where, look, if there's being money created by the government, there'd probably be less created by the banks. If there's more money being created by the banks, perhaps that's a sign that times are good. So there needs to be less money created by the government. And yet here we are. It looks like we've got both going at it, hammer and tongs at the same time.
Yeah. And
which sounds dangerous to me, as though we, that we could end up with, well, what we're seeing, a massive increase in the money supply. And I guess my question is that dangerous?
I think it's dangerous when it ends up inflating asset prices. And also, part of the danger is that people will spend more on consumer items as well. And you can't spend on travel these days. There's going to be a lot of shuffling of what expenditure is as well. And you can't go to restaurants. So that's likely to mean an increase in demand for commodities just from that shuffle alone. I mean, if you take a look at if you look at the entire expenditure, including travel, and compared that, I think you get a lower figure than just looking at consumption items alone. But if you look at the consumption items, of course, there's an increase in demand, given that reallocation effect of the budget during the lockdown. And then you have the supply chain disruption coming at the same time. So you get a double whammy on basic consumer prices.
And isn't there danger as well now that we get central banks? The moment a central bank starts saying, well, okay, we're going to reduce our balance sheet. In other words, we're going to stop buying bonds. That's the first thing. And then they're going to start selling the bonds that they're holding, bringing down their balance sheet. The moment they do, I mean, when they say we're going to stop buying bonds, then they are, well, I guess it may not have any immediate impact on the money supply, but the moment they start to say we're going to bring down our balance sheet, in other words, we're going to take the bonds that we hold and we're going to start selling them on the open market, then they are destroying the money supply. So this big peak that we're seeing, and we've never seen the money supply really go down. It's always gone up. I wonder whether this could be the first time, actually, that we actually see as they start to wind down their balance sheets, and perhaps, people start borrowing less from banks because times aren't looking quite so confident. That we actually start to see the money supply shrink. And when that happens, what does that do to the economy? That sounds like it could be quite a drastic adjustment.
That actually has happened before. It happened between 1929 and 1933 in America.
Right.
The money supply fell.
Yeah, they weren't good days.
And that wasn't a particularly hot time to be alive. So yeah, it is dangerous that becomes the dominant phenomenon, and there's some prospect of expecting that in the current circumstances. I wouldn't say it's guaranteed, but it's quite a danger.
But is it a danger? So the central banks are playing on dangerous ground. Would they be? I mean, and is that what happened with the with the Great Depression? Was that part and parcel of it? Was it the amount of money that was being created by governments and the actions of the central banks as to how they handled it? Is that an echo of what we're seeing now?
No, that's what if you look at Friedman and Bernanke, they try to blame it all on the Federal Reserve. But taking a good look at the data, the Federal Reserve is being reactive. But the real problem was that the private sector was desperately trying to pay its debt down. And when it paid its debt down, it reduced the money supply. And that led to a fall in a straight fall in monetary income that way, and then doubled up with a fall in the velocity of circulation of money. And this is what I call Fisher's paradox, because Irving Fisher, having got the 1920s completely wrong in believing that it would lead to an ongoing boom into the 1930s, he developed the debt deflation theory of Great Depressions. And an essential part of that was that when people repay the debt, you actually find that the debt ratio can rise. And he said the more debt is paid, the more they owe. That's why I call it Fisher's paradox. So you have people trying to reduce their debt, which they manage to do. So their debt level falls. But by reducing debt, you also reduce money. And by reducing money, you reduce GDP. So the debt ratio can rise even when people are paying their debt down. And this is what I call Fisher's paradox. And we could see a version of that in the aftermath to this boom in the middle of a crisis. If we start foreseeing reluctance to buy houses coming out of the increase in debt necessary to get into the game, and then you have people realize, I think, I can't afford this debt. I've got to liquidate. When they liquidate, they cause the GDP to fall as well, and you have a rising debt ratio, even though you have a falling level of debt. And that did have empirically in America between 1929 and 1932. The debt ratio was rising as the level of debt was falling.
But we could also, get the central banks contributing to this as well. You'd hope that they'd realise their mistake and turn around quickly. But if they start to wind down their balance sheet and they start selling off the bonds that they're holding, then that's destroyed money. And also you've got, like the Bank of England is saying that next year, not only are they expecting that they're not going to be buying up more bonds. So they do want to start selling it off. And also the government is there saying, we don't want to reissue bonds as well. We want to start reducing our debt by not reissuing to cover old debt. So they're expecting to, expect. So on the one side, you've got the government saying, well, we're going to spend less, and on the other side, you've got the central bank saying, oh, well, the money that we're holding, we're going to pass that off to the private sector. So it seems like they're going all out to try and reduce the money supplies, though that's a good thing in these circumstances.
Well, or disastrous if it causes the private sector to do the same thing, and you have a depression collapse. It is incredibly volatile times, and the wrong decision at the wrong time can trigger a decline, even though you largely blame the private sector's dynamics for causing it. The government can set that in train.
And do you have confidence in the bank? You've talked well about the Bank of England before, but you must be looking and thinking, hang on a second, this all seems a bit strange. I mean, for example, like lifting interest rates, for example, this week.
Yes, I know. So one of the funny things is there's a huge divide between the research staff and the Monetary Policy Committee. So very Danny Blanchflower on Twitter. He's scathing about the people in the Monetary Policy Committee, and he was one of them for a while, and always dissenting, and then being rubbished by the rest of them, including Mervyn King. And then the crisis occurred, and oh dear, we didn't see that coming, did we? He said, Danny said, well, I bloody well did, and you ignored me. And he's still having the same reaction to them now. So the people who get onto the Monetary Policy Committee aren't necessarily informed by the research staff in the bank. And then the bank itself has some research staff who are gung-ho about heterodox economics. They're building, stock flow consistent, Mark Lavoie godly models of the economy and having the role of money in there. And I hope some are using the sort of my Minsky approach as well. But you've also got the die-hard dynamic stochastic general equilibrium types in there too. So it's better than most of the other central banks, but it's still confused by a lot of bad ideas, and most of the bad ideas come from the Monetary Policy Committee.
And out of the two tools that they're using to large extent, interest rates, which obviously has always been the key tool for central banks, and then this holding of bonds, keeping them away from the open market, which one is most effective? It seems like from what you were saying earlier, interest rates probably have lost a bit of their power lately.
Yeah, well, if you wanted to take money out of the economy, like slow it by taking money out of the economy, you'd sell bonds to the non-bank financial institutions and to the non-bank public. So you and that would have more of a direct influence by changing the quantity of money than by trying to change the price of money. And
by changing the price of money, as we've said, you're hitting the small guy rather than the big guy. The big guy's not going to change his behavior in any way whatsoever. So, you begin to. So, I mean, that's a fundamental question. Do interest rates really work? Is it an old tool? Is it a blunt tool, a blunt instrument?
Well, that's Minsky would describe it as a blunt tool, because the only way it works is if you bludgeon the economy. You can't fine-tune with interest rates, because the main determinant of your desire to invest or speculate is not interest rate per se, it's your expectations of gain. So only by whacking up the interest rate to the stage where it crushes those expectations, or it causes bankruptcies for those who can't finance it out of their debt out of cash flow, then you have an impact with interest rates. And that is what we tend to see. It's not an accelerator. It's a handbrake.
So this is an interesting point then, isn't it? Because there's the question mark over, is the whole issue, if you look at modern monetary theory and the idea that government should be able to create as much money as they need to create full employment, the natural progression of that is to say, well, why don't they just run, and we've talked about this, why don't they just run a deficit with the central bank? Why do they need to go through this whole bond issuance exercise? But I think we've just described why, because it gives that ability for the central bank to fine tune how much money there is circulating in the economy. We wouldn't be able to do that.
If they actually, I mean, I have bought bonds myself, state bonds directly off the state government, so you can do it. But generally speaking, it's people buy and sell their bonds through the financial sector, and that means it's not the government that's controlling the capacity of bonds to soak up additional excess demand in an economy. It's the private banks, and it's bad enough having the control of the private banking sector. Letting them control money supplies, by controlling bond sales, I think is another.
No, but
very bad idea.
No, yeah, for sure. But if the central bank is there and the central bank is responsible for managing the economy, managing the supply of money in the economy. If we're seeing interest rates as a blunt instrument for doing that, the only way they're really controlling that is how many bonds they're buying up or bonds they're pushing back. That's the fine-tuning instrument. They can't do that if the government isn't issuing those bonds in the first place, if government debt isn't transferred into bonds. So that becomes a good reason to go down that road of governments issuing bonds rather than just saying, we'll just run a deficit with the Bank of England.
Yeah, the bonds play a productive role in manipulating the amount of money in creation, and the government should actually make more use of that than they do. But the trouble is it's mainly selling those bonds to the financial sector rather than first of all, to the primary dealers, and then to the rest of the financial sector, rather than selling it to the public.
So quantitative easing does have its place, doesn't it?
It does in one sense, but what it's done, I think, is indirectly help inflate the stock market, because when you do that QE, when you buy the bonds of a non-bank financial institution like a pension fund or an insurance company or a superannuation firm, then they get money which they can only use to buy financial assets. So ends up your program of buying bonds, and therefore creating money by putting money into the hand of the non-bank financial sector, ends up causing asset bubbles.
Yeah, so you need more government bonds. You need governments to get even more into debt so they can't do that, so that they hold some and the central bank holds some. Anyway, look, it's a complex picture, isn't it? Absolutely. I think we've just shown how complex the whole financial system is. But I think we made some headway there. Good to talk, Steve. Catch you again next week.
Thanks, Matt.
Next time, we look at government subsidies, government handouts. What better to look at during the week of Christmas? We're all happily giving. Should governments be giving more too? And if so, how do they pick which companies or industries to subsidise? Aren't governments notoriously bad at picking winners? And isn't there a degree that any moves they make can have unintended consequences elsewhere? So can we simplify the way governments support industry? That's next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. See you next week.